shocks. And that's why we talk about the medium-term growth magnets for the economy. The entire philosophy of economic management revolves around making it easier for people to pursue their economic activities in individual lives or for businesses, and ultimately leading to efficient resource allocation and, more importantly, enhancing the potential of the economy to grow at a higher rate. And that includes, obviously, it is an indicative list and not a complete list, agricultural growth, a trust-based governance model, public goods for inclusive growth, both infrastructure, digital and physical, and many other things which will come under that, involving the private sector, and more importantly, managing the energy transition, reducing our dependence, and also addressing climate change issues as well. It is not about the government doing things for the people, but also involving people in the process. Everybody is a participant in the development process. That is why it is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikkas. So it is not just a government being an enabler, but government being a partner to economic growth. First, we deal with one of the pillars, agricultural growth. Thanks to many of the initiatives which you see around this slide, what you see is that the share of private sector investment or capital formation in agriculture has reached a level which is higher in the last 12 years. Since 2013-14, 9.3% of overall gross capital formation is contributed by the private sector in agricultural sector. And it has been facilitated by the creation of the Agricultural Infrastructure Fund, a national agriculture market which has linked farmers with direct buyers, FPOs which take into account organic farming options as well, and more importantly for the farmer, income support as well as risk management through crop insurance. All of these things have paved the way for greater participation of the private sector in capital formation in the agricultural sector. This sector is no longer about being a primary sector. It also has tremendous export potential, as we have been observing lately in our merchandise goods data for the last several years. What about the trust-based governance model, the second pillar of the development and growth strategy? The Insolvency Bankruptcy Code restores trust between the borrower and the lender. The borrower has an exit option and so does the lender. And that is the key to this. And the important thing is, more than 7 lakh cases, even before they come into the IBC process, have actually gotten resolved before they enter the process. And that is the most important thing, which doesn't get captured in the data. The usefulness of IBC is in ensuring borrower payment culture even before they enter into a resolution process. Ease of doing business, one illustrative example is the Real Estate Development Regulation Act, which has ensured trust between developers and buyers, making them more transparent and check-based transactions rather than relying on black money. Effective governance is about making sure that the public don't feel threatened by legislations and rules and regulations, and every time they commit a mistake innocuously, it need not be deemed a criminal offense. So decriminalization of many provisions of Companies Act and several other economic offenses restores trust between the governing and the governed as well. And in terms of the trust with respect to public accounts and public money, there are many dimensions. It is not just about the quality of expenditure that has gone up in recent years. Of course, capital expenditure in government budget has gone up from 12% to 19% in the last 5 years, and revenue expenditure share has gone down. However, it is not just about the quality of expenditure improvement. The way the government has become more transparent with respect to the budget deficit numbers, the prudential assumptions being made for budget deficit calculations, etc., expenditure management, making sure that public procurement is transparent and enables everyone to compete and have a fair shot at becoming a supplier to the government. All these things are part of fiscal and public expenditure management. Now, moving on to the more macro dimension of it, if you look at the last 16 years, there is much talk about today of India's high deficit debt to GDP ratio. You can see that among the countries that saw very little increase in the public debt to GDP ratio, India is one of them. India, Germany, and Indonesia in the last 16 years. In fact, you will see in the survey in chapter 3, we have done an exercise, a counterfactual exercise. In 2019-20, 2021 and 21-22, instead of the actual nominal GDP growth rates which we experienced, if only the economy had continued to grow at a rate of 10% nominal terms, the fiscal deficit and debt ratios would be a lot lower than where they are today. The point is, because of India's growth dynamics and the cost of capital being lower than the nominal GDP growth, there is enough scope for the fiscal parameters to improve in the coming years once we achieve sustained and steady growth as we expect. And that you will see in chapter 3 on the fiscal side. Creating public goods for inclusive growth, that is the third pillar. And it is not only about physical infrastructure, although it is an important part of it, in terms of the amount of kilometers of highways completed, electricity installed capacity. This is RBI showing that in 2011, if you put them as an index value of 100, where they stand today in 2020, excepting the case of railway track, which because much of it was laid already, and therefore even a 14% improvement in 9 years in terms of 8,000 kilometers added is a very big number. But in every other case, national highways or cargo handling capacity, the growth rate is 80% or doubled in the last 10 years or so. And on the softer policy side, apart from physical milestones, you have public-private partnerships, the national infrastructure pipeline, the national monetization pipeline, which will improve economic efficiency, as I mentioned earlier, and the PM Gati Shakti, which is still in its early years. The underlying purpose of it is to make sure that public investment projects get completed without cost and time overruns, and there is synergy between various departments such a way that sequencing happens naturally and logically, and therefore delays are minimized. So PM Gati Shakti is about reducing information asymmetries and making sure that government projects are executed on time and within cost estimates. The national logistics policy is an important cog in the wheel. Our export competitiveness is hampered by the fact that logistics costs constitute 14 to 15%. The goal is to halve it and bring it down to international levels, and this national logistics policy will play a very important part in that. The public digital infrastructure, about which now there is a lot of justified optimism on India, not only in the country but outside as well. The initial phase of reforms started with the identity and then the Jan Dhan Yojana, financial inclusion, Aadhaar and mobile. And then it moved on to unified payment interface, which allows even payment as small as 2 rupees through a barcode, common service centers for IT-enabled services, PM Disha, digital DigiLocker, BharatNet, and services at a click. Now, they have set the stage for new age reforms, which is now going to make sure that hitherto neglected segments of society, low-income households and micro businesses, get a fair shot at accessing national and international markets and getting funded by financial institutions. These digital developments allow all of them to leave their digital footprint, which creates a credit history for them so that they are able to access finance as well as access markets. And that is the potential of digital infrastructure. Even though it's almost 5-6 years old since the beginning, formal study of how much digital infrastructure contributes to growth is yet to be undertaken. But it is my belief that India's improved balance sheets and the digital infrastructure together will add anywhere between 60 to 100 basis points to India's potential GDP growth, which is what we were missing in the course of the second decade. This is an elevation and enhancement in India's potential GDP growth because the baseline is assumed to be around 6% by many international organizations. But what is important is we have a financial cycle that was disrupted in the second decade. that is coming back. And we have the new development, public digital infrastructure, that is adding another 30 to 50 basis points. So together, these two developments add about 50 to 100 basis points to the trend growth which many organizations peg for India at 6%. And that is why my optimism is that in the coming decade, rest of the decade, the potential GDP growth, without taking into account export potential, because the global economy is still rife with uncertainty, the growth rate could be around 6.5% to 7%, rather than between 6 and 6.5%. Ultimately, economic growth is only a means to an end. And what is that end? The end is prosperous and dignified living for citizens. And therefore, basically, the chapter on the social sector, in a departure from the previous economic surveys, we have actually brought it to the front of the economic survey. After the initial state of the economy, medium-term outlook, fiscal and monetary affairs, inflation, the sixth chapter in the survey is on social sector, and perhaps it is the longest and the biggest chapter in the entire economic survey this year. And there is a reason for it, both in terms of its placement and its size, because the interventions made by the government have been substantial, and it is to make sure that no one is left behind. This is about inclusive growth. And as you can see here, and the survey, not only the full document, but the highlights also capture the elements of this with outcomes as well, ranging from electricity, healthcare, food security, affordable housing, drinking water and sanitation, all the way to cooking fuel, all-weather roads and skill development. Outlays have become outcomes, and they are covered in detail in the social chapter. More specifically, in terms of outcomes, you can see here, general government spending, both union and state governments put together. Education spending has gone up from 5.3 lakh crores to 7.6 lakh crores, and health almost more than doubled in the last 3 years. And other than health and education, we have gone up from 4.86 lakh crores to 8.3 lakh crores approximately. The outcomes are seen on the right side. Primary school dropout rate has come down from around 4.7% down to 1.5. The pupil to teacher ratio has improved from 34 to 26, and there are going to be 14,500 PM Shri schools to be established in the next 4 or 5 years. And while we are seeing the pupil to teacher ratio improvement happens, it is a matter of time before they also show up with respect to the cognitive and non-cognitive skill proficiencies of our students in the primary and middle school. Health and education are two important pillars of any family's life. So the gamut of health initiatives, starting from the National Health Policy on your bottom left, continuing all the way in 2022 up to Pradhan Mantri TB Mukt Bharat Abhiyan to end TB by 2025, National Mental Health Program. Of course, it will be a travesty if I leave out the successful COVID vaccination program. You only have to look at several other countries to understand how important a role this has played in ensuring a quick turnaround of the economy and restoration of normalcy in our own daily activities. 2.2 billion doses and still counting. And that is a success of the not only the vaccination planning and execution, but also its role in economic recovery process. Again, it is not enough just to speak about the policies, but also important to mention the outcomes. Maternal mortality ratio has come down in the last 7 years, 167 to 97. Child mortality ratio has dropped from 45 to 32. And under 5 mortality ratio has dropped from 39 to 28. Because of these, and because of government's health insurance programs, a family that used to spend nearly 2/3 of health expenditure on its own is now spending only 48%. And stunting in under 5 children is down by about 3 percentage points, and institutional delivery births have gone up from 79% to 89% in the country, which is a good sign, which means it will naturally have an important role in reducing both infant and under 5 mortality, as well as more and more institutional births happen. What about the private sector participation? Well, the tax cuts of 2019 played a big role in ensuring that the private sector was able to repair its balance sheets quickly and consider investing, about which I will show the evidence later. And this also has paved the way for production-linked incentive scheme to be implemented. This scheme is a very important strategic decision. If you look at the history of East Asia, there was active industrial policy that played a big role in them joining the first world within a space of a single generation. An industrial policy that does not so much as reward winners but punish the laggards is what East Asia did. And today India sees an opening in the global supply chain. Countries are willing to diversify, not only because of pandemic, but also because of political reasons. Just-in-time inventory management has given way to just-in-case inventory management, and it is about friend-shoring, etc., and therefore India sees an opportunity. There was a talk of India having prematurely deindustrialized. I would say that India simply had not industrialized enough. There was never a premature deindustrialization. Infrastructure was missing, and manufacturing at scale was missing. These two missing gaps have been now plugged with the creation of physical and digital infrastructure and the PLI policy, which basically ensures that India is able to create global scale in local manufacturing for export markets. And the important thing to remember is PLI is a portfolio approach, and there is no payment in anticipation of performance. Payment of incentives happens after the units perform and deliver excess production over and above their benchmark. If they don't produce, they don't get the incentive. So it is a payment against performance and not payment in anticipation of performance. National monetization pipeline is going to unlock the productivity of public assets through leasing or outright sale, and this investment you saw in the privatization of Air India, and it is clear that the government also articulated its policy towards public sector enterprises, hoping to retain its presence only in core sectors and exiting non-core sectors. Foreign investment licensing norms have been liberalized. There is automatic route for more sectors now, 100% automatic FDI, and there is a single window facilitation portal, the outcome of which is seen in the actual gross FDI inflows. The blue line shows you. As a percentage of GDP as well, it has gone up from 2.2% to 2.6% of GDP. And ultimately, the various investments, whether it is domestic or foreign, have to translate into employment. Urban unemployment ratio has come down during the pandemic peak of around 20% down to 7%. And the worker population ratio has picked up from a low of around 35% back to around 45%. EPFO payroll data, which tracks new workers joining the scheme with salaries of 15,000 or below, in 22-23, their levels are running well above the previous 3 years. And in terms of the facilitation of employment, the eShram portal provides a bridge between employers and informal workers, and the National Career Service has registered 2.8 crore job seekers and 6.8 lakh employers as well. So what is going to happen is that as the private sector investment begins to kick in, and as the construction sector comes back to life with rural migrants getting back to their urban employment opportunities, the employment scenario will pick up as it did in the first decade as well. In the first decade, the capital expenditure resulted in employment generation, and that is a phase that India is looking ahead to in the coming years as well. Micro and small businesses, we all know that India has a preponderance of micro businesses, but the recent changes in changing the threshold and also adding a new criteria turnover apart from investment, and more importantly, the provision of emergency credit line guarantee scheme during the pandemic have enabled that this sector remains in good health. And the evidence of it is what we see. GST paid by micro, small, and medium enterprises didn't really flag or slacken in the pandemic year. They kept up. If anything, they registered gradual increases from 18-19 all the way to 21-22 as well. Energy transition. This is both a matter of security, energy security, as well as ensuring that India deals with climate change. India is well ahead of its target for renewable energy mix in the overall energy mix balance. And we have 8 missions now addressing climate concerns. We updated our nationally defined contributions in COP27, and there is a national green hydrogen mission launched, and the sovereign green bond, the first tranche of $1 billion was just auctioned. We got a better yield. They were able to sell the green bond at a 6 basis point lower than the conventional sovereign borrowing cost, and there will be one more coming in the current financial year. All these issues are covered, apart from the global dynamics of climate change, etc., in the chapter on climate and environment. Of course, for most of